Back to how Mouse ruined comics.
Okay.
All right, 30 seconds. Your 30 seconds are up. No more boomer music.
Stop right there, criminal scum.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's another Wednesday. It's another episode of the Mattriarchy. I am, as per usual, your host, Matt Rhys. And I gotta say, I'm a little disappointed in today because Matt C., whose face is in front of us, is not here for the reels. And I was really expecting him to follow up with the whole intro line.
I mean, really, we could have just cut it right there. Talking about like, how about how Mouse ruined comics? Just, okay. And then we could have just segued there. We didn't even need to go to the rest of the intro because that's what we're doing today.
That is exactly what we're doing today. But the problem we have here is that we're now going to talk about how Matt Krotz ruined the Mattriarchy.
We'll have to make a new edit.
Oof.
Dave is here. Tony Sizzle is here. The Star Storyteller is here. I think Evie is here. If she was here earlier anyway. And I think this is everybody. The Metal, who I thought was going to be on the panel, but I must have remembered wrong. Got my wires crossed because he hadn't read Mouse yet. But tonight I am joined by Larry Bernard.
Hey.
And number one Marmaduke fan.
Hey, howdy, hey.
Now, how many times have you read Mouse there, Marm?
Probably once every other year since I was 13. It's one of those I like to revisit every now and then. Yeah. And I have to be careful because every time I pick it up and start on page 1, I will read until I get to the end, and then I'll look up and say, oh, crud, there went my day. Oh, no. I'm not. I wish I could be the Matt C. voice of opposition today, but I guess I'm going to be the token fanboy for today's discussion.
Well, I think I can take Matt C.'s role fairly well on it. But I will also have Twitless, who has been binging Mouse material in preparation, not just for the show, right? Tell us a little bit about your recent Mouse escapade.
Yeah, actually, it was for the show, but it's also it's really great because I sometimes use this show to kind of I'm someone who needs deadlines. I need structure. I need someone to say we're gonna have it all read by this. I guess it's just because I've been in school my whole life, but because if you just say, oh hey, it's a book and it's there, I'll get distracted. But since I knew we were doing this show, I was like, I'm gonna do all this Mouse homework, and right around that whole controversy there, I watched Spiegelman's interview that he did regarding the removal of the book from the curriculum and from the Tennessee school. I read the transcript of the school board decision, and then I reread Mouse, and then
I got to interrupt. Taylor read my mind. That's what I was trying to
Mousecapades.
say.
Yeah.
Mousecapades, and I got myself all mixed around.
Gosh,
thank you.
You have Spiegelman would be just cringing if he heard us talking like this.
Well, I should hope so.
But then
he also doesn't critical discussion of the book because it's sort of how do you critically discuss a Holocaust survival story?
I will tell you how. But first, let's go on with. I interrupt Twitless enough. Go on.
Tony Sizzle says Twitless has been binging too. Yeah, it's bad for your health. No, so but yeah, I was just trying to devour a bunch of material on it, and there's a lot there because Spiegelman, even though he's not, in terms of putting out graphic novels and stuff, he's not the most prolific author. Of course, he hates the term graphic novels. I should just say comic books or something, collected editions, however you want to say it.
Yeah, these were published as independent chapters before it was collected.
And raw. But he's not the most prolific author, but he's pretty significant. It's the only comic book.
I know I have a friend of Art Spiegelman's that had some insight on that. So one of my teachers was a comics professional. She was pretty good friends with Art Spiegelman, and she would kind of talk about how after Mouse, I guess her wording of it was that he was sort of mostly done after Mouse. Like he still does like little art projects. Kind of the fame of Mouse has got him into like the art, like the fine art scene. He does like comics as paintings, comics as print kind of things. But I feel like he did his one and done thing where after Mouse he doesn't have a big, giant book left in him.
He's doing
he also might have some like neurotic problems. Like it's hard to create. It's hard to approach a work like that kind of work again.
He also says, and he's even like done this, like represented this in graphic form or in comics form. He calls it the 500. I think it's the 500-pound mouse or something that basically like haunts his career. He also, in addition to him, it kind of taking a lot out of him. It's like a really long book. And he doesn't really usually work in very long forms. The success of the work, especially since it was released in 2 chapters, the success of the first chapter almost, destroyed his ambition to do the second book. And he kind of was a bit of a victim of his own success in a lot of ways. And he still is. In that interview that I just saw, he mentioned again the 500-pound mouse and how when he thinks about like future projects, he doesn't want to do something that would reflect or damage the legacy of that book because of how much of himself and his family and his people group are wrapped up in it. And so it has like, there's a panel that he's done, and it literally has I think it's like Vladek as Mouse and casting a shadow over Art. And he clearly feels very determined by this work.
Okay. So I want to break for just a second, a little contextual aspect. One of the things in revisiting, and I did not get to read all of the stuff I wanted to read up for the show because I had a real world problems. My computer was being awful last weekend. It was actually my browser that was the problem, but I was doing all kinds of things trying to fix my computer that weren't wrong with it. Anyway, one of the things that I feel so strongly about this, and it's not intended. I was watching Marm. I watched your review of your solo review of Earthboy Jacobus earlier this week.
Yeah.
And you misgenerationed Tanaple through the entire book because he's not a boomer. But
the thing is, I use the term boomer in the incorrect internet way.
I know you do. You just mean old man.
The millennial Gen Z old guy problem.
Hey, Doom was a great game. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I do think Doom was a great game. But the thing with to be specific about it, like the boomer stereotypes and a lot of the archetypes that fit into that are Spiegelman's precise existence, right? I think one of the things that I'm probably going to say more than once in relation to the thing is I think that there is a level of boomer narcissism that taints the work in a way that I don't think was obvious. It was obvious, but it was disacknowledged previously because of the subject material. But it really colors. Once you see it, you can't unsee it, and it's all over the thing. So, but that's a little prequel. So, let's all talk a little bit about how we first came to experience Mouse. Larry, you go first.
I don't remember exactly when it was, but it was when the graphic novel first came out. I was a teenager, and I was like saying, "Hey, it's a comic book with mice about Nazis," and I heard it's like serious and artistic, and I read it, and I didn't remember much of the context of it from when I originally read it, and then I reread it for the show. I'm like going, "Oh, well, this isn't really very good."
So how old were you?
I was like early to mid teens when I read it originally.
And you said you were underwhelmed after having rewrite it after so many years.
Yeah, I was extremely underwhelmed. And when I say it's not good, that's not to say it's not crafted well. It is an explicitly and exquisitely crafted book. The art is technically competent. I don't think it was the correct art for what he was doing. But if the goal was to be about something of the living history of the Holocaust, I don't think it's a good text for that. And I think that's what the book is supposed to be, in addition to Spiegelman trying to wrestle his demons, so to speak.
Now, that's a really interesting perspective, if I might pontificate for just a moment on that. The idea that you feel it's not a good living history of the Holocaust. And the reason that is specifically interesting to me is that a few weeks ago, when this whole thing with Kentucky school district, right?
I think it was Kentucky.
Kentucky. It came out, and Twitless said, you should
Tennessee.
read this. And he sent me the transcript of the whole conversation on it. The story is that there was a curriculum that had been put in place during COVID at this particular school, and it hadn't been vetted by the school board. So it was in violation of state regulation because it hadn't been vetted by the school board. It had just been put in, slap a Band-Aid on it. We're going to have a Zoom meeting about it, and everybody go hide from the flu. And this is the first year that it's actually come up, because the curriculum was done last year, but they didn't have this unit. They had to cut it out because there was only a 3/4 school year and blah, 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 blah. And so apparently the school board, and it's a elementary and junior high school board, and they've been getting complaints all year about the curriculum from 3rd grade to 8th grade. And one of the big complaints was a lot of parents didn't think that certain parts of Mouse were very appropriate. And but it was inserted into the curriculum. It was built as part of it, because it was supposed to be an excellent living history of the Holocaust. So the fact that you feel that it didn't accomplish that goal is very interesting in light of modern events.
Yeah. I think it's very good to represent his family's living history of the Holocaust, but that doesn't necessarily tell a living history of the Holocaust.
So Dave
So
says,
what is a living history of the Holocaust then? Like interviews with survivors, like what does it take to constitute that?
All right, let me as you think about that, answer that question. Dave says, I remember being at Steve's Comic Relief at the Franklin Mills Mall in Northeast Philly, early 90s. Some guys were talking to the clerk about how good it was. I thought it was uninteresting, got my Punisher books and split.
So
on the internet right there.
So to be a good living history of the Holocaust is a very complicated thing, part of hundreds of years of European history. In turn, the Holocaust is embedded implicitly in Central and Eastern European Jewish history and Central and Eastern European history, more so because that's where the real heartland of what we know as part of the story is. But in actuality, the Holocaust was a giant machine that took place from the Spanish border all the way to occupied Russia, and people were fed into the machine. And this tells a snapshot of occupied Poland, which has had an oversized part of the narrative of the Holocaust. So it doesn't really tell a good history of the Holocaust. It tells a history of a corner of the Holocaust, and in particular of one family in that corner of the Holocaust.
Right. So the problem with so I guess maybe one problem with Mouse is, are we talking about Mouse as document of the Holocaust? Are we talking about Mouse as independent comic art? Are we talking about Mouse as family portrait and like a individual, right? So because it's about an individual family, it's going to be narrow in its view of what it's focusing on. And then I guess there's also like how Mouse ruined comics. There's also Mouse as the big famous graphic novel that started sort of like elite intellectual analysis, at least for like the New York Times. It's like you see it on the back of the book, right? The first masterpiece in comic book history, the New Yorker, right? There are a lot of angles,
And
so
also,
does something have to be an expansive history of the Holocaust for you to say that, okay, that makes this a good document to discuss? the Holocaust. It can't be like an individual family's perspective. It's got to be a like broader historical look at the
It's
thing.
not that it's an individual family's perspective. The Polish story of the Holocaust with the little asterisks of Anne Frank, that's everybody's story that you hear in popular culture about the Holocaust. And that's all we have here. It's like Dinner with Maury plus Diary of Anne Frank plus every Polish story of the Holocaust. It's very generic. And that's the problem, is if the point of Holocaust education is to tell people why this is bad and why this shouldn't happen again, it shouldn't be generic. It should go to the core and the foundation of what happened. Not a generic, hey, remember the Holocaust movies? I'm going to tell you a story that basically touches all of those themes and touch points.
Okay. Even though there's a family history angle to it. So here's the question: How does someone tell a story about an individual family's experience without falling into so how could any Polish person document their family's Holocaust experience without running into that problem? Because it sounds like the problem is, well, if you focus on just the Polish experience, I guess you're not seeing the Holocaust from a broad enough lens to understand why it happened and learn the lesson of history from it. Where does family history fit into the bigger picture of talking about big international events in history?
So let me tell you a particular acquaintance of mine's story. His family were wealthy artisans in Vienna. They had a theater. When the Nazis rolled into Austria, the Nazis tried to steal the family theater, and the laws hadn't caught up with the dictatorship yet. So they won in court. The family fled into Romania because they had relatives there and they realized it was a bad deal, and they ended up getting caught there in a labor camp. They didn't actually get brought into the death camps because the Romanians were part of the Shoah, but they weren't crazy about it. The same way the Italians weren't crazy about it until the Nazis occupied Northern Europe. And that's the thing, is certain countries were very into feeding Jews into the machine. The French were notorious for being part of that. But other parts of Nazi-occupied Europe and other parts of Axis Europe weren't a part of that. And that's something you really need to suss out.
Where the Danish king was actually funneling money to secret Jews up to Sweden and stuff.
Mm-hmm. And the Norwegian king was similarly motivated.
Mm-hmm. So, well, and I think that there is something to be said for, and I think from the chat, Mr. Solomon says, "How could anything be but a small snapshot of one small piece of the big story?" And I would agree with that, but I think one of the things that might fall is that because this gets so much attention, this particular piece gets so much attention that we don't see the other parts of the story, because all of the bandwidth is being taken up by this particular comic that won the Pulitzer Prize. Would that be a fair?
Yeah,
it's kind of like Harry. It's like Harry Potter is good if Harry Potter gets kids to read, but Harry Potter is bad if Harry Potter is the only book you read.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say you can't just read Mouse and think you understand the Holocaust, but I think it maybe as the counterpoint, getting a very intense perspective of this one family's experience, at least speaking just for myself from personal experience, that's a way of making it emotionally resonant. That's what art does, is it makes stuff emotionally resonant. So I could understand the broad politics of Nazi politics and the Holocaust, but sort of seeing it happen to a family is, at least for a 13-year-old mind, a way of waking you up and saying, okay, this affected real people. This tore apart, mothers and fathers, right? You start to see yourself. I think it's easier for a young reader, especially, to see themselves in the role of a person rather than try to get into the head of a political machine.
So I'll add a further addition to Marm's point, which is, and this is something that Art points out, when he wrote Mouse, he wrote it at the nearer the beginning of the Holocaust literature movement, and he comments on that, and he says now it's an entire genre. When he wrote this, it wasn't. So there's a certain thing that, like, we read it now, and especially if you pick it up now, you'll go, oh, this is Holocaust lit. But you kind of have to read it, or at least have that kind of historical standpoint of when he wrote this, he was one of the trailblazers, especially in comics.
Mm-hmm.
But in other fields as well, the field of Holocaust had not, and if we started in the 70s or whatever, like he we're in 2021 now. There's like and Art actually goes on about this, and he's really cynical as a human being, which I'm not going to comment too much yet because it's part of my overall problem with him as a person. But he talks about he bemoans the fact a little bit about the fact that there's a Holocaust movie every year now. It's just a stable genre of like media. But when he wrote this, it wasn't. He was an early trailblazer in that storytelling.
It's like writing an isekai manga before isekai becomes cringe and everybody's doing isekai.
Exactly. That's the way Art sees it. Especially.
Is that how you pronounce that word?
It is Isekai.
Isekai.
That's true. Yeah. Good point.
I have no idea. Oh.
All right, so we got some interesting points in chat. Star Storyteller says Audrey Hepburn actually did performances for that as a Dutch ballet dancer, but because of the shortages, she couldn't be a dancer. She had to be an actor. Mr. Solomon says good point with Harry Potter. Star Storyteller, that's a mouthful. Star Storyteller says like what happened during Star says like what happened during the Weimar Republic, that the elites at the time became super gross, kind of like our elites. Interesting. Taylor says, but it's not like our knowledge of the Holocaust comes from Mouse. We all had our classic understanding long before knowing this comic existed. All this does is give more details.
My personal opinion about Holocaust education as a Jewish convert, and before I was a Jewish convert, is Holocaust education is terrible and has been terrible since the 1940s. And Mouse is part of that terribleness.
What's the terrible part? What makes it terrible?
There's a certain ethos that, this magic German man with a funny mustache happened and then everything went wrong. When in actuality, the Holocaust was hundreds of years of threads and veins all converging into one horrible, terrible moment.
Historic anti-Semitism building up to a crisis point, basically.
Spiegelman actually says that it's I believe he takes the long view as well. He says that the Holocaust is the proof that Western civilization was a failure. The Enlightenment culminated, basically kind of tying that link that the Enlightenment promise of Western civ was it has a tombstone at the Holocaust.
I mean, Hitler was an anti-Enlightenment politician, so I don't think that's what it says.
I'm not saying I agreed with him. I'm just saying that Spiegelman takes
and also the fact, I think one of the things I think is the biggest misunderstanding about the whole Nazi era is how early it started. I think it's an American conceit that we, especially since we're so far distant from everything that went on in Europe geographically and by time, we didn't necessarily, I think, notice that it was going on as much, and I don't think we remember that it was going on. But Hitler rose to power in 1933. He was almost a decade of policies that progressively added up to this point. He didn't just show up one day, he won the election, and then the next day there's brown shirts marching in the street. It was actually the opposite story.
There was
sorry. I do have to interrupt really fast. I am there's Mr. Solomon mentions Landsman's Shoah. I'm gonna watch that, I think, for a class in the next couple of weeks. So it's so weird that you just brought that up. Isn't that the 9-hour film? We'll wait for Miss. Yeah, I just thought it was really cool. Sorry to interrupt. You guys get back to it. I was just like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna watch that movie.
Right.
Now, HBO had an excellent movie on the Wannsee Conference, which featured different factions in the Nazis who were all anti-Jewish, but to different degrees. And it featured how they were all coalesced into a singular vision on how to efficiently and industrially exterminate the Jews. And that's sort of more the realistic thing. It's like everybody came in and a very small group of people were able to harness their hatred like a sharpened blade. and the people in Europe feel once Hitler and the Nazis were defeated that they're not responsible for what they did. And those same people, the children of those same people, are now the ones who are very tolerant of Islamic groups within their own country, saying very anti-Semitic things about Jews within their own country.
And that's a whole
how is Mouse
perspective.
How is Mouse contributing to, you called it like the myth that Hitler came around and invented this problem?
Because the Nazis in here just magically pop up. They just magically materialize.
And part of that's a side effect of the fact the story starts in like 37 and goes on from there. So
yeah,
part of that's just it's a I don't necessarily.
I don't think it was Spiegelman's intention. I don't think it was his intention. But because of how the limits of what's in the actual story, that's what happens.
All right.
Because the only things that aren't part of Vladek's story are Art's story, and everything else is, I mean, it's fixed on that time frame.
And Vladek tries to mention things outside of the Nazi frame of reference, and he gets and Art wheels him back in.
So we've been kind of talking about the work. Do we want to like just keep bouncing around? Do we want to? How do we want to?
I want to wrap around one more thing. So I have a method. Okay. We've kind of gone a little bit of far afield, but I think it's a good framework. Marm, what is your history with Mouse?
All right. So I was homeschooled, and then my mom loved using historical fiction as a way of trying to get me into history, because I struggled with, like dates and names. So she'd think, okay, I'll find some kind of like adventure book or something, right? So obviously she was attracted to Mouse as well. It's a comic book. Josh loves comic books. Oops, I docked I guess my first name has already been docked, right? So she grabs on. So obviously, like the logic of the teacher is, I need to find some way to teach this kid about this important historical event. I'll use this, and then I was immersed by the art of it, and it's kind of like how 1984 sort of wakes you up by the brutality to Winston, right? So whatever its merits as a work of art, it kind of woke me up to the point that I thought, okay, this is clearly important. I ought to know more about this, right? So whatever its faults may be, and I won't be a fanboy for art. Like I actually see, even as like a kid, I remember like pausing and thinking when he had that like 4-page section where he started going to his therapist, and thinking, this is kind of weird. I want to hear more from the dad, right? Like and maybe that's like one contrast to make is Art speaking versus Vladek speaking. I would say like my kind of like reaction to it as a child was being haunted by it and immersed in it as a work of art, and kind of basically like it forcing me to realize that I have to take this topic seriously. Right. And I think that not just anti-Semitism, that itself needs to be discussed in its own right, but also kind of like the human tendency to destroy other human beings at an alarming rate. Like that's a really haunting thing in history. And I think that Mouse effectively makes the point that that's ugly. It's not a 30-minute, like I think he's talked about how he doesn't like Schindler's List, because movies like Schindler's List use the Holocaust as like a romantic setting for like a romance story or an adventure story with a happy ending where the Jews get away, and that kind of art doesn't necessarily prepare you to think about why does a thing like this happen. Like the obvious thing you want with a work of art like this is you want to learn enough about why this happened so that we can avoid having it happen again, right? I think so maybe to push back against Larry. I would say that it works as getting like a kid to wake up and say, we got to take this topic seriously, right? So I think that's its strongest merit, just from my personal history reading it. And then I would revisit it every couple of years, kind of like as I got older. And I did start to see some of the same criticisms I've heard people mention about kind of like Art's maybe more neurotic side. That came across to me more as I reread it as I got older.
Mrs. H has joined the chat, and she's really popping off some interesting points. She says,
I'll go ahead and put that up on the screen. I was actually looking for an excuse for that.
I think the biggest issue with education when it comes to the Holocaust is that they act like Nasty Mustache Man and Bad Boys, is that it doesn't address that the evil lives within our hearts even now.
Yeah.
And we pretend that Mustache was an anomaly or the boogeyman, but he was just a charismatic man that brought ruination to others under the premise of saving his own people. Also, I would say that there's a lot of like World War One and how World War One ended that literally set the stage for all of World War Two. So,
and I think it's important to remember that like World War One, which in some ways is still going on today, if you buy my view of history, but like it began by premising that war is impossible now because we humans have figured out exactly the right amount of tension to keep anyone from ever shooting anyone again. And then we spent the next 100 years destroying Europe. So
100 years plus.
Yeah,
I do want to bring up that Marm, the 4 pages you're talking about are really interesting in a sense because Spiegelman mentions that, because it is weird. It comes a little bit out of nowhere, but Spiegelman kind of had a breakdown after, because this book was published in 2 parts, and there's a whole history behind why. And part of it had to do with Steven Spielberg, actually. Steven Spielberg was about to come out with An American Tale, the story about
and he wanted to get his book. He needed to get his book out first before that damn movie came out. Yeah.
So he only had about half the book finished, and Spiegelman has issues, and he was terrified. He really is very afraid. There's a lot of fear in his life, and he was very terrified that if his book came out second, that people would think that Mouse was a ripoff of An American Tale. And he actually has an anecdote to support this, because someone was talking to I think a relative, I don't know if it was Francoise or somebody, and they said, "Oh, that Spiegelman is really talented. And not only did he do Mouse, but he did E.T. as well." So people did conflate Spielberg and Spiegelman, but he released this part 1 first, and it was so successful that it paralyzed him. And then his father died on top of that, and he had a hard time like restarting the gears and actually getting into the second part. And he relates that writing this 4-page kind of therapy, as it were, is what allowed him to continue working on the story. That he was paralyzed until he wrote these 4 pages, and then he was able to kind of restart and kind of get back into it.
And the irony of that, it allowed him to finish his story, but this is also the death of comics right here.
Yeah.
This is how comics dies.
And also, since I've converted to Judaism and have a great deal of friends who come out of the Eastern European Jewish experience, now that I read this book after having that deeper set of connections and ties to all that, the text is so fundamentally Jewish that there's all sorts of levels of nuance to the text that you just don't get if you don't come out of that world. And there's just all sorts of flavor in the text that you just don't get if you're not Jewish.
It's a type of Jewish, because he's very much not a practicing. He's a very atheist. He's secular. He's coming from a very particular, almost anti-Jewish Jewishness.
No. This is
bizarre.
Anti-Jewish Jewishness is one of the most fundamental Jewish things.
Okay.
I'm trying to remember a phrase because my former pastor was Jewish, and he said the thing about atheist Jews is that they know exactly what the God they don't believe in expects of them.
Yep. But this drips with the Jewish experience from every page, and now that I understand what's dripping from every page, it just comes off more bland to me because of that.
Taylor's going to call me out in the chat. Side note, that I thought you said Civil War ruined comics. That's fair.
I mean, comics could be ruined more than once.
Yeah, it's a big genre. But what I was specifically referring to in this case was the self-insert of the author at the expense of the greater narrative has been a facet, especially of indie books. I did Has been at the expense, especially of indie and biography books since then. And that's one of the things that was the hardest. If you guys go back and if you guys find any of this kind of conversation interesting, you want to go check other things you've done out. We did a thing on Gene Luen Yang's Dragon Hoops about a month ago. And there was a similar moment, not this moment exactly, but there was a similar moment where the author inserts himself so heavily in it that it actually stops the narrative dead. And they have to get the paddles out and fix that. So it's quite a moment in the story. But anyway, so Twitless, I was going to ask him how he was first introduced into the thing, but he's gone. Oh, and Mr. Solomon's got a comment from the chat that's going to jump ahead of my premise a little bit. It's a typical Northeast urban Jewish milieu. Spiegelman is a typical pinko boomer man-child with parent issues, common for his generation. Yeah, I think there's a lot of that. I think there is a lot of that aspect to the piece that I think negatively affects it. So I guess while we're waiting for Twitter, let's go back. I'll talk about my experience with getting into Mouse, growing up in comics, reading Wizard. I heard that this was the comic, right? This was one of those things. It wasn't superheroes. It was something different, but everybody's got to read it eventually. So when I was 23, I suppose, I checked it out from the library, and my wife and I both read Mouse 1 and 2. And sorry, Dave, you're cracking me up.
That's a good one. Put that one on screen.
Okay. I did not say that, but that's hilarious. I never said that, but that's hilarious.
I mean, I would unironically defend Super Pro as a comic book.
Anyway, but yeah, so it was one of those things where I read it, and at the time I was really, this was, like I said, the 23-year-old me was really impacted by it. I really loved, especially the first volume, and I thought the second volume kind of went off the rails a little bit. It was way too much about, what particular, trauma of the day Spiegelman was dealing with. And I'm not trying to be dismissive of it. He had some serious issues. His parents went through the camps. They barely survived. They took that baggage with them, right? I'm not trying to say that wasn't a real experience. But I came to the book to read about Vladek and Anya. I wasn't interested in Art as a character. And there was so much of that, especially the second volume. I felt that he inserted himself in ways that undercut the story of his father's survival. But until this reading, I felt the first volume was, I had thought that the first volume was great. Didn't have that. But in reading it this time, I do feel that he undercut a lot of what was going on through his own experience and his own hang-ups and problems in a way that actually divorced reality from his dad's story, and took me out of it as a reader. And of course, I have grown cynical and cranky in my old age, so maybe that's a big part of that. I don't know. But I felt like his interjections of his own problems, like being mad at his dad for throwing out a trench coat, I'd never cared about that. It did demonstrate how much his dad was affected and how much that stuff he carried with him. And so there's a truth statement to that. But it was just all about Art's reaction to his dad's neuroticism and hang-ups. It wasn't about it just deadened the impact that these traumatic events had on Vladek, because the narrative is pushing me to feel sorry for this boomer kid that I just don't care about.
So on my second reread, I actually felt kind of the opposite. And I think it's partly because Holocaust lit has become such a genre, like Spiegelman said. And so I know this story forwards and backwards in some ways because I've seen it 1,000 times. The story that actually did interest me was the Art and dad story. Although, like I said, I actually side very much with the father in that. I'm very pro Vladek. And again, we need to do a stream where we cover MetaMouse, because there's interviews with Art, his kids, and Francois, his wife, and they give a whole new spin to like that dynamic and their relationship. And because Francois and Vladek got along very well. And Francois just says, oh yeah, we got along really well. And she says things like, I thought he was endearing. And so the image that we get when if you think Vladek is cute, which I did, and him portraying him as a mouse makes him even cuter in some ways. He's just kind of an adorable human being in so many respects.
I would never use the word adorable to talk
He
about
is-
a dude, B
he's portrayed as a mouse character. There's an anthropomorphism aspect to that. But his behavior, where every time that Art basically is like throwing up his hands in the air, I always was endeared to those things. And I think partly is because I had a very old great grandmother who she did not live through the Holocaust, but she and Vladek could have been siblings in how they kind of were in their behaviors. And that ties back to a point that comes up in the book a lot, which is the fact that Vladek's behavior on one hand is very much impacted by his experience. On the other hand, it's impacted not at all, because Mala and several other characters come out and say, we are nothing like him. He was always like this.
Yes.
So his need to kind of control his environment, his survival instincts. I actually kind of have had a relative who was from the Depression era, and she's very much like Vladek. So I think part of that might be as well.
Well, and I mean, there's a certain level of skills. Like I used to work with homeless kids. I was for a very brief time, I was a homeless kid. And there are certain privation like affects you, right? I was probably 25, maybe 27 before I realized that I didn't have to worry about where my meals were coming from because of a short period of my life where I was that poor, right? And I had a shocking realization one day where I was, I had to realize I was at a social event where they had like snack crackers, and I had taken the last of the snack crackers, and I had already eaten earlier in the day, and like they were just sitting out there on the table for long enough, and so I was like, well, I guess no one else is going to eat these. I'd rather don't want to see them get thrown out, and so I had this plate full of crackers, and I was just munching on them while I was talking to people, and I realized I had an enormous plate. It wasn't enormous, but it looked at that moment to me to be an enormous plate of crackers that I didn't need because I was getting chunky, and I had, I ate well, and I could afford groceries, which hadn't been the case 5 years before. And
it stays with you. Those things stay with you.
And I mean, and all of my grandparents went through the Depression, so I mean, there was some of that I think I absorbed. But my point is that like a lot of old Vladek's behaviors that I see are things that are like, that they seem obvious. Like, the old man climbing up on his roof to fix his own. Of course, you're going to do that.
Of course. I'd like to bounce back though and say that back to the reason why Vladek and Spiegelman's relationship is so interesting to me is because as much as Spiegelman talks about this, like, how much he's diving into his story, there is such an untold one that you have to infer between his real relationship with his father and why he behaves towards his father in the current day. He shows only like one scene, I think, of himself as a kid with his dad, and the rest of it is recounted in him just kind of summarizing. Oh, my dad and I always fought. Oh, my dad was always saying this. And the rest of their dynamics, you have to infer what actually went on. Like there's the Hell Planet example, but everything else, there's this crazy untold story of Spiegelman's growing up and why he is the way that he is. Well, and so when I read this story, I was just I'm on a reread especially, I'm really just intrigued and immersed more by that than I am by the story that I've seen and read at this point like 1,000 times. So it's weird how that kind of plays out now.
I want to add to this Vladek Art distinction, right? Because I think it's an important point. So when Vladek is telling its story, Yeah, he is. He has a very distinct voice. I felt that same kind of charm for him, and a lot of the negative things Art reveals about Vladek, I kind of feel like that could be like the boomer resentment of dad thing, or that could just be I'm trying to be honest about who my dad was. So he says things like he shows his dad being a little fastidious about money and driving his new wife nuts, or maybe most memorably, he illustrates a scene of his dad getting freaked out because their cab driver is a black guy, and Art thinks that's his dad showing some kind showing bigotry, right? It's almost like I don't care if Vladek behaved that way or was kind of a grumpy old man in some ways. It's creating kind of like this moral dilemma where is Art being unfair to his dad by relating this much about him to us, or is he trying to create a complete picture of the man? And I love the man, faults and all. So I'd actually would kind of like to do is I'd really love to hear like the tapes of his dad talking, and I'd be interested how much of his dad's voice is preserved in Mouse. And then a lot of the criticisms is Art kind of living up to his father's legacy and his father's story. Like, is Art as a comic artist as good as his father as the storyteller? And what I'm assuming is Art is doing like tons of work trying to arrange his father's stories into a readable format for us, right? Like, I don't think it's that much fun trying to sit through hours and hours of the interviews, but he is successful at, I don't know, maybe like isolating his father's story down into essential points.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, that's definitely there. I actually, since we're on that topic, I actually have a clip of Vladek's that we could pull up. We could all hear him. I love his voice. Let me know if you can hear this.
Like playing a pinball machine and trying to keep it from tilting.
That's Spiegelman.
It's really quiet. Can it be louder at all?
Let me see if I can make it louder. It's not super loud, but I'll try.
And
is that better?
That was basic decision making now.
Is that a little better?
Maybe a little bit. I'm gonna be real quiet.
Everybody had to go to Auschwitz, and outside was standing a closed bus without windows, with opened a very small, two tiny small windows. In the truck, we were all together, I, mother, and women, men, everybody together. We were sure that we are going to be finished. We knew that we were going to Auschwitz.
We knew that Auschwitz was a death camp.
Yes, but we knew that we'll go there and we'll not come out anymore. This we knew, that will gas us and burn us and all.
Did you know about the showers?
Yes, sure. We knew everything. Later, it was very late in season. The war started in 1939, and this was 1943 already. And we knew everything what was going on.
So, it's really interesting when you hear his voice and then compare that. Now, Spiegelman actually said that he couldn't match the exact cadence and the word for word because sometimes it didn't fit in the word balloons. So he had to occasionally change the exact wording, which some people may find to be interesting. Some people may actually not like that. There's this one, the moment I noticed it, Rhys, you're muted.
I was saying every letterer knows that pain. You gotta, I mean, if you write dialogue, I do my own lettering for comics. I have to chop my dialogue like in half. I mean, you just got to. There's
this quote though, and it's actually I think one of the chapters where it's "Here my troubles began," and in the actual recording, he says something a little different. He says something like "Here my pains were made more" or something. So he says something slightly different, which is I was slightly disappointed in because like that way that wording "Here my troubles began" it sounds like, and he makes it like a chapter heading. It made it sound like, oh wow, this is really important. And then when I actually heard that the wording was slightly different.
Well, see, I always interpret that as art statement. Like it's called the first volume, which is the one I brought with me tonight. It says my father bleeds history, and here my troubles began. So okay, Art. Yeah,
I mean, I gotta wonder
how bad you got it.
I gotta wonder if maybe Vladek's story, the way he said it, was translating the Yiddish expression into English, and it may be something that sounds more resonant in Yiddish than it does in English.
It could be.
Well, he's speaking in English. He's speaking in English for most
Right.
of the transcript.
Right, but what I'm saying is he probably thought more natively in Yiddish.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay.
So that could have been like, sometimes like certain Eastern, Central European speakers, to a lesser extent, Asian speakers I've encountered, they try to say something that makes sense and has a certain idiomatic symmetry in the language that they think in English, and it just doesn't come out right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he was Vladek was very multilingual.
No, I know.
Yeah. So like he could be thinking in probably several languages. I'm surprised that he's so fluent. Actually, it's really impressive. It speaks again to the man and how. The more I read this book, the more impressed I am with Vladek. I will say that. The less impressed I am with Spiegelman, the more impressed I am with Vladek. Although I do have to make a certain distinction. Spiegelman does make a slight distinction. I don't know how big it is, but the Art Spiegelman of Mouse is not 100% him. It is partly a creation. It's obviously very much based on him. But he has noted in some places about how like you're not supposed to do a 1-for-1. Maybe it's like 0.75 or 0.8. I don't know exactly where that line is.
Do you think he might be projecting his feelings onto the conversation? Like if he might have thought he might have been mad at his dad, even if he didn't like yell at his dad in the actual comic page, that kind of thing?
That was okay. So when I was looking through some of the recordings in MetaMouse, I've not gone through them all. I was actually looking to see if I could hear any of, because occasionally they meant there's a couple times he's got the tape recorder and they actually do kind of yell at each other. But when I heard the recordings back, I did not hear those moments. So part of me wonders if the answer to that question is yes. If he's not projecting some and coloring some of those moments.
So is the art is the art in the comic the real art, the art inside that he didn't want to show out to his dad? Is the inner art more of a tyrant than the external art?
I think that there might be something to that. It's possible.
Or is the art of the art he wished he could have been when he was speaking to his father in his final days with his father?
Who knows?
Okay.
I do know that I being someone with very little filter, I tend to have a little less respect for people that won't just say what they goddamn mean.
So remember the issues we had with Yang, and Matt C was mentioning how like he's using the art as therapy and so on. Art Spiegelman is very much doing that here, and it's not even like we wonder about it. It's like on the page, it's on the panel. So it's very clearly a part, like that. Those 4 pages that Marm was bringing up earlier, he literally had to go through like a sequence of therapy in order so that he could continue the work.
And he didn't just have to go through it; he had to spend the time drawing it.
That's what he says.
Man, you're okay. I'm not trying to be ungracious, but man, your catharsis is not my problem, man. That's the. Anyway, the other thing about talking about this whole thing about Art and his dad, one of the things that I had not picked up on earlier that I read this time when I first read Art, my sons were infants, right? And reading Mouse again as my sons are grown. So this exchange, it's on page 97 here. I'm going to read it off to you. This is after Vladek has called Art up early in the morning. I need some help getting on the roof to go work on this thing. To go fix up a pipe in my roof.
I'll pull it up. I got it.
Okay. Yeah, it's 97 in the 2-book edition. I don't know if the numbering is different in the other.
I think it's the same. If it's the one, is this it?
Oh yeah, that's the one I'm looking for.
Okay.
Yeah, he wants me to help fix his roof or something. Shit. Even as a kid, I hated helping him around the house. He loved showing off how handy he was and proving that anything I did was all wrong. He made me completely neurotic about fixing stuff. I mean, I didn't even own a hammer before we moved into this place. One reason I became an artist is that he thought it was an impractical, just a waste of time. It was an area where I wouldn't have to compete with him. What a little bitch.
Jeez. Good Lord, man.
I mean, like, okay, like your dad's better at everything when you're young. That's how it works, because you don't know anything because you're a child, and you master the skills that your father's excellent at, so that you can do the things he needs to do. You know, is maybe this is growing up as the grandson of farmers, as in growing up in a rural environment, but I mean, I can't even understand that whole mentality of like, my dad was always trying to show me up by fixing things around my house. I can't even change my my switch plates because my dad made me feel guilty about it when I was 7. Oh my God.
Okay, let me get into another angle on this. How much of this could be Art doing concession, right? This wouldn't work with a Catholic metaphor since he's not Catholic, but maybe it's like a parallel to a Catholic confession thing where I'm going to unburden the ugly little man I know I am on the inside and put that on the page so that I'm honest about the ugliest side of myself, right? So if I'm going to show you the ugliest side of my dad, I have to show you the ugliest side of myself. Could you interpret it as Art taking that kind of like honest angle? Or do you think that Art sees himself as a hero in his own head when he does
and that's what he thinks he's doing, by the way. What Marm's saying is what he believes he's doing with the book.
That's 100% the language of therapy. So this is, psychotherapy 101 kind of language that I believe that's exactly what he's attempting to do.
And so maybe it's just my biases toward the heroic myth that forbids me from seeing this in some sort of therapeutic sense, where you screw your courage to the sticking place and slay the goddamn dragon, and maybe that's my own bias. I don't know, but I was reading when I read that I was about well, that's what I thought. I was like, give me a goddamn break.
I feel like it's time to bring up Picard. So I have a bit of Harvey Picard's. This is an exchange he did. If you want to pull it up.
Is Picard Jewish? I don't know much about Harvey Picard at all.
Yeah. Based on what Twitless said before we started the show, he's 100% Jewish based on all the things he was being critical of.
But I wanted, before Mr. Solomon had a great comment in the chat, I want to hit that before we get to that. There is a point that we like Art in the story when his presence illuminates some aspect of his father, like in the opening vignette, which is great. And I do agree. That's an awesome, awesome vignette. Book 2 may stray a little bit when we get too much Art without exposing or examining some aspects of Dad. And that's a very interesting structural point. I'm going to have to give that some more thought. I like the way you're going there, Mr. Solomon.
Yeah. Art as a chronicler is interesting. Art is not interesting.
Larry, you're just enjoying the double meanings of Art here, aren't you?
I mean, yes.
Okay. All right, let me zoom in a bit so I can make this more visible. Okay, so I'm going to skip around a little bit, but let's focus on... So to give a little context here, apparently Harvey Picard, the author of American Splendor, he collaborated with Crumb and some others, big in the underground scene, big on David Letterman.
And he started doing comics with Crumb. Actually, Crumb started doing comics with him, but Picard's worked with dozens of Indian comics people.
And they're both
comics
so basically Spiegelman and Picard are both speaking in a similar idiom or similar register in terms of the underground comic scene. They both come from there, and they both come from similar ethnic backgrounds as well. So he says, well, on the subject of Mouse, he has some earlier criticism we can get to later if we want. He says, let me also point out that I didn't simply object to Spiegelman portraying his father, Vladek, negatively. I objected to Spiegelman's writing a self-aggrandizing autobiography in which he went out of his way to make himself look good, that is, the long-suffering son, at his father's expense, emphasizing the old man's faults to the point of redundance and de-emphasizing the affection and concern Vladek felt for him. This caused a Village Voice reviewer to conclude that Art was the hero of Mouse, this brave artist, she called him, and Vladek, who lived through the Holocaust, the villain. Spiegelman claims his portrayal of his father is objective and sympathetic. Actually, it's fake. Literally, actually, it's fake objectivity. He tries to disguise his hostility to his father. At one point, he shows himself lying to Vladek about not publishing information concerning his father's early life. But Art says in Mouse he's doing it to humanize Vladek. So we're supposed to forgive him the lie because he's improving, humanizing Vladek's image. Rather than come out and tell us the truth about his loathing of Vladek, Art puts the heaviest criticism of his father in Vladek's second wife's mouth. That way, he looks like a reasonably dutiful son, and Vladek gets trashed. Even when Vladek does something... I know he just full broadsides, full broadsides.
I want to stop just for a second here and interject something. That one of the other things I noticed with this book is like he totally like poisons the well of relating Vladek and Mala, right? He doesn't say they have a complex relationship. He doesn't say whatever. He says they don't get along, and then he portrays several scenes of them getting along. They have conflicts, but they're making something happen, but he poisons the well the first time he introduces Mala with it.
And that gets into the complicated way Jewish men of his cultural and regional place of reference, they either have their mother as the horrible shrew in their life, or their mother is the one who neurotically pampered and spoiled them. So the fact that there's this other woman there, that's another weird aspect of the story, to me anyway.
So let me skip ahead a little bit so we won't read the whole thing. He does call out the whole Mala thing a bit and says that, hey, look at Vladek trying to show concern for you with the money when Mala is trying to almost cut Spiegelman out of the will, it seems. It's probable that Vladek had faults as a father, the kind of faults many Eastern European Jews exhibited when they tried to impose their values on their kids in America, not realizing that the USA isn't Poland. However, Vladek also had virtues as a parent. Art seems to have manipulated the facts in such a way as to put Vladek in a bad light while making himself appear sympathetic. Vladek is a complex person. Whatever his motivation, Art's done a poor, confusing job of portraying him.
Wow.
And that's some of the he's got some structural criticisms we can also take a look at in a minute, but what I love about Picard is Picard did not give a crap and would say whatever he really felt, which is why I'm like, Rhys and Picard would get along, I think.
Yeah, the thing I love about Picard's stuff, like this is totally unrelated. I had to read a big chunk of American Splendor last year for a class, and one of the things I love about Picard is he takes these mundane, like stupid stories in his life, but with his prose and the way he's able to work with the artists, he transforms them into these like uplifting or heartbreaking but very real vignettes about life, and they become like holding down a job becomes high drama with Picard's pen, and I don't know how he does that, but I love it.
It's probably because he was a scrappy little guy who made drama out of anything, including reading Mouse.
Okay, I'll give you that.
I really have to say, yeah, I agree with everything Picard is saying about, how the Jewish experience informs the text of Mouse, and particularly the Northeastern survivor of the Holocaust is your parents, born in America, living life of privilege and luxury experience.
Okay, so Spiegelman had an answer to at least this criticism. He said, I was made painfully aware of the fact that the question is, are you ever struck by how people conflate the art character with you in the sense that they don't pick up on some of the self-critique that's going on? And Spiegelman's answer is, well, I was painfully aware of it when Harvey Picard went into several years of attack mode in the Comics Journal back in the 80s. What he was saying included the fact that he'd have been a lot better of a son than I was. Basically, all of the information that he had about my father's life and mine was obviously from my book. The fact that as an autobiographical author, he didn't seem to grasp that there was some distance, some degree of objectification going on was staggering. Picard was like, gasp, I found Spiegelman out. He was being insensitive to his father. Well, yeah.
Well, it was all for just a second there. It was just about to be a underground comics diss track going. Then he cut it. He undercut it. Spiegelman, you missed
the other
out.
one I'd really like. Have you guys ever heard about the Jeff Smith, Dave Sim epic war?
Oh, did they? That sounds cool.
Oh God, it's weird. Yeah. I gotta make a video about it sometime since I'm a Jeff Smith fanboy. But yeah, anyway, that's too off topic for today. I just love indie comic wars. Well, that's the thing. If it's happening today, it's drama. If it's happening back then, it's history.
It's history. Yeah, it's historical.
There's a total side. Oh, actually, I don't want to get off on it. I listened to an amazing video I'll tell you guys about later today that has nothing to do with Mouse, but has to do with dramatic conflict.
All right, so since we're still here, I do want to read just a little bit more of his criticism on the structure, just a tad.
Okay.
And I think this also ties into some things we've been discussing just a tad, but since everyone was kind of loving the bants, let's give a few more. I have and this is where he actually, I think, goes even harder in some ways. I have no general bias against anthropomorphism and symbolism, as some readers assumed. Rather, I thought Spiegelman handled them clumsily and sophomorically in Mouse. What's the point of using symbols and metaphors when they're so thin and obvious as to be pointless? Spiegelman's employment of them in his original 1973 Mouse story, which was more of a fantasy, made more sense. There, the father was not identified as Vladek. Portraying Jews as mice and Germans as cats, as they are in his Pantheon book, which is plainly a biography and or autobiography with anthropomorphism arbitrarily imposed on it, is just a gimmick. George Orwell used anthropomorphism in Animal Farm, to which Mouse has been compared, but he didn't identify the pigs explicitly as Lenin or Stalin. Orwell's work was really allegorical. Mouse is not. Even though Spiegelman uses symbolism. I've used symbols too, but I'd rather they be felt than immediately understood. I'm not interested in playing games for the sake of playing games. Spiegelman has been praised for distancing himself from his narrative with his anthropomorphism. What he's actually done is dilute its intensity, and by doing so, unintentionally make Mouse more commercially successful. It's been claimed that people are inured to the I know, right? These burns. It's been claimed that people are inured to the Holocaust by now, that to get their attention with a Holocaust narrative, you've got to package it differently. That's baloney. Whenever Israeli politicians want to justify their brutality towards Arabs or ask for support from other countries, they drag foreign statesmen to their Holocaust museum, Yad Vashem, and show them documentary evidence of the horror. After touring Yad Vashem, most visitors are shaken. They haven't seen cats and mice. They've seen real human suffering. People don't get inured to Holocaust stories. It's too terrible an event to be taken in stride. Spiegelman's watered down Mouse, however, it's not too painful for them to read. Spiegelman could have used the drawing style he used in Prisoner from Hell Planet in Mouse, but that would have been not have been as artsy as employing animals. And he has difficulty distinguishing being arty and artful, and between gimmickry and genuine innovation, as do many comics fans.
Wow.
I told you that this was fire.
Wow. So I was going to bring up the animal thing in a little bit, talk about it. Oh my God, though.
So
let
me go on a little bit further.
I need a minute.
Okay, all right. Okay.
Ow.
I told you this was
man.
You know, there's an Archer reference I can make, but would be horribly inappropriate right now to make it.
Mr. Solomon says that's a fun diss, but I think it's unfair. It's possible. Picard is just he's loading both barrels, but it is an interesting read. Let me continue giving a little more here. Let's see here. Another problem with Spiegelman's anthropomorphism is that it stereotypes nationalities, which is particularly unfortunate in Mouse, in that the Poles are shown risking their lives for Jews, yet are portrayed by Spiegelman as pigs. Jews were not treated as first-class citizens in Poland, but that doesn't justify employing a doctrine of collective guilt to implicitly condemn all Poles by picturing them as pigs. This can lead to embarrassing problems. Chicago cartoonist Kabul Sobosinski, a Polish American, told me that while Spiegelman was autographing a copy of Mouse she'd brought for her mother, she asked him how she might explain the Poles as pigs metaphor to her mother. Spiegelman disingenuously replied that he'd pictured them that way because Poles eat a lot of pork. I regret you having to use an anecdote like this to make a point, but do so because Spiegelman fans are so worshipful, they can't bear to read anything negative about him. You should hear some of the absurd rationalizations they've come up for his using the Poles as pigs metaphor.
Oh, man.
I mean, it really is the Hitlerian racial ideology as cutesy animals.
Yeah, there's definitely some of that. Well, and the other thing that I found about the animals in this rereading is that I felt that, like, Vladek, and by extension, Vladek's immediate family, and by immediately I mean, his in-laws and all that stuff. Like, I was able to identify with them really well, but all the other characters, in their sameness, they lost something to me in this reading. Like, okay, so I don't know if you guys know, my buddy Rico did a comic about prison and about some experiences in prison, and he used funny animals to juxtapose some of the hard things in his discussion about prison. And I thought it was really good because using the funny animals allowed you to see the characters, and by seeing the characters, you allowed to see people. Whereas I think if it had just been drawings of people, you'd look at them as prisoners instead of as individuals. So I thought it was an artful way of explaining all that kind of stuff. But in Mouse, because everybody's identical, they stop for the most part, except for the people who've had a lot of screen time. I wasn't able to invest into the stories of these individuals that weren't named or were named casually because they just look the same.
Yeah. So Spiegelman has a reason for this, and like I said, I do think Picard makes some interesting points, and like I said, it's kind of entertaining to read. I think his criticism goes way too far. But he was getting into a fight with someone else in the journal, and things got increasingly more heated to the point where he and this other critic started calling each other like literal names, like "you retard" and "you can't read," and it got really, really deep. But not deep, but like cutting.
Yeah. Picard is not a person to take harassment lightly.
And I want to say
harassment.
The artistic style of the animals in Mouse doesn't really do anything when it's juxtaposed with the horror. If you were to take something like Watership Down, the cartoon, Matt and I are.
I mean, that cartoon, the one with like the opening scene that like traumatizes you as a kid.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that one. Okay.
The cuteness and the violence juxtaposed together leave a strong message that is the intended message of the work. Or if he straight up went for like a 1930s Disney house style, that juxtapose would have sent a really strong resonant message. I think his style is bland for what he's trying to do with it being animals.
They don't have the expressiveness of cartoon animals.
Yes,
and
part.
Yeah.
Some of that is intentional. He's doing this kind of like, he's doing this maneuver where he is simultaneously embracing and critiquing a dehumanization of the mouse subject. Mm-hmm. The fact that he portrays them as mouse at all is embracing the Nazi metaphor, but he's doing that to hold it up to critique. And the reason why he makes them all kind of very similar to each other is to kind of, in a metatextual way, sorry to use that word, but in a metatextual way to draw attention to the fact that as in a tribalistic kind of viewpoint, that you would just see an entire race of people as just a type of animal with almost no distinction to it. So whether or not that works, I think is a separate criticism. He is doing it on purpose as a stylistic choice. Mm-hmm. And that's also kind of gets a little bit into the pig thing. He has a defense of it that's a little bit more innocent. He says he was looking at things like the Porky Pig cartoon, and he had mouse and cats set up really well. But when it came to portraying other races of people, he got more complicated. And he kind of just said, I was trying to find an animal outside the cat mouse food chain, and I found Porky Pig. And so basically he saw the Polish people as another farm animal that the Nazis would abuse. Mm-hmm. So he wasn't, according to at least what he says in MetaMouse, he had a better articulation than what Picard was accusing him of there.
The thing I can't get around with that, I mean, I guess I can see some reason in that, but at the same time, like pigs are not kosher, right? They're ritually filthy, you know? So that ain't a good look either.
No, it's not.
Yeah. Huh? I mean,
and also the Slav is the root origin word of slave. So the Slavic peoples were treated as garbage throughout their history of Europe. And again, making
Which
them
is not
pigs.
to excuse their treatment of the Jewish population in Poland.
Right,
There was some
right.
there were pogroms, there were all kinds of stuff that
Yeah.
were and by that point, my understanding of Poland in the early 20th century, they had come to sort of an uneasy peace at that point, based on
history,
mutual economics. But
the history of the Jews in Poland is fascinating, but the fact that you're taking a race of people who've been denigrated as slaves, as subhuman, as part Mongol because the Mongols were viewed as subhuman, and you're casting them as pigs, that's just not a really good artistic decision.
That's you're killing me. It's not a good artistic decision.
I talk a bit about the animal metaphor and whether it works. The thing is, the fact that they're animals doesn't add a lot. I think if you had them as humans, if you had them drawn as simple little cartoon people, I think this would work based on the power of his father's narrative. So it's sort of like his father's story is kind of carrying a lot of water for Art. I want to push back on how do you draw if you decide to do it as animals? Then the question is, Picard's accusation is that Art Spiegelman's trying to do an artsy thing with the animals. Maybe that's true. Who knows? Who knows what the inner consciousness of art is? I can imagine there are certain types of artists who are comfortable in that venue, right? Or like, oh, I have a hard time drawing people. I'll draw animals, right? And I actually I think that would be forgivable or would be sensible. I think there is a separate from whatever arty intentions might be. I think there's something that works about having the animals separated from a fluid, luscious, beautifully drawn Disney style, where as they become less expressive, it's sort of like his art becomes less important and the words become more important, right? So ironically, the crudeness of the art is taking some of the emphasis off of Art Spiegelman's drawing style and putting it on the narration. So in that sense, I think that the sort of stiffer animal drawing style is actually helping the effect of the work because it's not distracting from the words with, it's like how Walt Disney would draw. Like that would be an artsy thing. Oh, well, if I did it the way Walt Disney would draw it, that makes it like a comment on the cutesy Walt Disney fantasy world and how that's not really whereas if it's stiff, he becomes less part of the picture.
Yeah, and I think you're definitely on something there, but at the same time, that's what makes the self-insertion of Art and his happy time fun therapy session more egregious to me, because then it places attention off of his father's story and off of his father's character that's carrying the weight of the story, and then puts it like into Art and his fun personal problems.
Now, forgivably, so the thing is, I think it's about 4 pages, right? So if he has like a section where he gets off into his, therapy discussion, it's forgivably short, I think. And the question is, does that therapy problem harm the rest of the work? And there may be even this ironic element where, well, part of the point is he's affected by the Holocaust. He may be affected by the Holocaust through his father's experience of the Holocaust. And that we're getting around to the problem of, has Art failed to communicate his father's story to us without him infecting it with his neuroses? Or does this is kind of like what we talked about earlier? Is he adding to the work by saying this has affected me too, or is he detracting? Is he detracting from it? It seems like the consensus is he's detracting from it. But it sounds like you really like the angle of Art's back and forth in his relationship with his father, right? Do you think he's detracting from it? Okay.
I like the angle a lot, and I actually don't think it's a detraction. But like I said, part of that is because of how I am reading this and rereading it. I think if Holocaust literature were new and I was reading it in 1972, I feel like Rhys's comments, I would resonate more with them potentially, or 1978 or whatever.
Yeah.
But reading it now, like I said, I'm so used to. I hate to say it, but I'm very much as a culture. Like I said, you get a Holocaust narrative every year, and in high school, you probably read or watch like at least more than 1, 2, or 3. So there's something about the personal relationship, and to me, it's also the mystery of it. like I said, the untold story that Spiegelman is not saying, even though he's being so transparent in some ways on the page, but he's holding so much back at the same time. And that tension to me is utterly fascinating. And so diving into that relationship he has in the modern day with his father is, to me, the thing that really sucks me in. So it's interesting. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work for everybody.
I just want to punch him in the teeth. I'll be honest.
Let me address. There's an elephant in the room that needs to be addressed here, which is Spiegelman's worldview. And this is where I really start to dislike him. Setting aside that I think he's put together however you spin it, Picard acknowledges this, so everyone can kind of acknowledge the fact that whether you like it or critique it, Mouse is a significant graphic literary work. Like it just is. It's significant. It's the only one to win a Pulitzer. So, but putting that aside for a second, Spiegelman's worldview, and this is something that I really would like for us to revisit when we take a look at MetaMouse. It is highly anti-life in some ways. Spiegelman comes right out, and he mentions this with the Pavel when he goes to visit that psychiatrist, and he doesn't put this in Mouse, but he mentions it later. That psychiatrist comes out and admits, "I am a nihilist." And he basically, and Spiegelman's like, "Well, then if you're a nihilist, why are you doing such good in the world?" And the therapist says something like, "The most nihilist thing you could do, I guess, is to be ethical," or something. He reconciles it that way. And Spiegelman his worldview is one that is very nihilistic. And I think that if you think about the book as a conflict, or as not just a conflict, but maybe a dialectic, perhaps, the tension between two opposing worldviews, I think it's fascinating to realize that Spiegelman's view through nihilism is one that ends up being very focused on death. Mm-hmm. And therefore it is, in a sense, one that is not very pleased. It does not fully believe in a narrative that is focused on life. Now let's think about Vladek for a second. Vladek's entire story, his entire life, is being the survivor. And even when you hear his voice, when you hear him talk about Auschwitz, when you hear him and you read about some of the interviews and you see him depicted in the comic, Vladek was a man who put the death behind him and focused on living. There's that powerful panel where Anya is basically saying, "I cannot go on. I cannot live anymore." And Vladek basically just using pure philosophy of life. You must live. We must live. And that was Vladek. Vladek is a man who, even after Anya died, believed in life and continued to live. He could have killed himself. He did not. He, for the rest of his life, I would say he represents to me, maybe I'm taking this too far, but he represents to me a man who is focused on life, and therefore he's the survivor. And Spiegelman cannot fully believe in that. And therefore he is a cynic. He is a nihilist. And this permeates the work. So let me explain what this has, the consequences of this for the style. So Spiegelman was terrified and plagued by anxiety that if he were to portray the happy ending, let me bring up the final image, if I can, of Mouse Volume 2, because he actually talks about this panel, this page in particular. So let me zoom here as a very important discussion here. But the very end of it ends with a kind of happy ending for a moment. So let me share this. Share. So it ends with Vladek and Anya finding each other. Okay. And Vladek actually, I listened to this clip. Vladek actually says, "More I do not need to tell you, we were both very, very happy." Okay. Spiegelman, however, because you can listen to Vladek say this, and then Spiegelman talks about his construction of the page, and he says this page has like 3 endings to it. He said we have the ending that's got the happily ever ending, but Spiegelman does not believe in those happily ever endings. He thinks they're trite. He thinks they're not real. So if he were to portray stylistically this triumphant triumph of life, it would not be true to reality, it would not be true to the horror. So right after that, we have to have the tombstone. Okay, and that tombstone, and then after that, we have the signature of Spiegelman. So the book, like, it ends on top of endings, essentially. We have the ending of Vladek, basically saying, I have no more stories to tell, with the full knowledge that Anya has died, and then they both die, and then Spiegelman is, putting the end thing there. But stylistically, Spiegelman is torn between the fact that if he goes too photorealistic with things, he feels like it's garish and and kind of like wrong. But if he were to cartoonify it, if he were to bring that semblance of like life triumphant, he thinks it would bring false. So he settles for this kind of verisimilitude, in a sense, this sort of like quasi-realism that can never go too far with its idiom. But his worldview is why we got this work. And I think it's really important to work around that.
But also, I think the reason it has to end on the gravestone is his father died when the second book was done, and that was really from a old school Jewish artistic religious perspective. That's the way you have to honor somebody at the end.
Mhm.
You don't do from that old school perspective a lot of like art about it, like a lot of visual art. It's just the grave is the grave, the end is the end, the life is what matters.
Right.
Even
Well,
though that's something art doesn't believe in.
Right. But here's part of the thing. Like, I don't ending with the tombstone, I don't think is necessarily the problem, because I think the issue, okay, like, our business as human beings, right, is to live for the next generation. Right? Right. That's the whole thing. We build the future. And I mean, like the happily ever after for Vladek is, his boy made it to adulthood. He found somebody, they settled down. It's going on from there. He survives the Holocaust so that life can continue. And it does. And that is what hope is. I mean, like, our numbers is coming up eventually, right, for all of us, and that's the way it is. But that's not a bad thing when you've got people to carry on. But like, this misses that. I mean, it like shoots right past that. No, I mean, I don't know.
I also want to circle back to something Marm said, though, because I think something he said about how he makes it simple, so we focus on the story and the narrative. And that's at the core of why I say Mouse ruined comics, is because it doesn't want to be a successful comic. It doesn't want to tell a successful comic story. It uses the art to effectively tell the written word, the verbal story, but it's not telling the story as a comic book. And that's why it's insecure about being a comic book, and everybody praises it. So they're now writing insecure, hollow comic books because of Mouse.
Ooh.
I don't. Yeah,
that's
Marm,
an interesting side note.
What is the relation of simplicity to art? The problem is, I see comics as the trash art form. Like, if I want to look at good painting, I'm going to go look at Renaissance painting. And I kind of like that comics is the trash art form, right? And they're like good art, they're good illustrators, like Rembrandt, but they're all working in superhero comics. Like, all of the great Rembrandtian guys are doing big buff Superman. They're the John Buscema, right? So to me, it's like having doing a thing where you have a consistent, simplistic style can work, right?
Right.
Which is what art is doing, right? So is it bad, or is it bad because fans take that and they imitate that without it being just think it's cool and artsy?
Well, in my opinion, it's bad because he doesn't want to be doing a successful comic like the Crumb stuff. The Crumb stuff was telling effective stories within a specific comic artistic style, and it was telling a visual story. using words, but it was telling a visual story. This one's telling a story with words, and it's throwing visuals as a wrapper to make us buy it. It's cynical, it's hollow, and it's empty.
It's cynical. I don't know if it's hollow or empty. It's very cynical. I think the cynicism
to discuss hollow or empty. To discuss hollow or empty, I'm gonna interrupt everybody for a second and reassert that it's my show. Taylor says, so totally playing devil's advocate, could the grave be the image of a pair of lives lived to the fullest and leaving a legacy? I think it could have been, but what we don't have in there at all, the book before the tombstones don't necessarily reflect that aspect. And second of all, Art also leaves out, and I'm not sure what year they were born, but he leaves out his children from the book entirely. So the idea of legacy continuing on past them. Yeah, his one daughter, Nadia, was born in 1987, so definitely could have been there at the end. And I don't believe she's in the work at all.
Well, it's because,
there's no legacy continuing beyond Art as far as the book goes.
The reason for that is because he's sticking to the chronology of his father's story, like at least in terms of like, and he died several years, I believe, before there was enough of a gap in between. So he would have to tell the story that you don't want to see, which would just be him and Francois. Because Vladik,
you don't have to have a story you don't have to have a story to explain that the daughter is there. You just show her there in the last panel. It's real simple. She just shows up there. Oh, look, it's a granddaughter.
You don't care about Art as much as we care about his dad, right? Like the point is that I need to leave some things out, or we're going to be here forever. I'm going to leave everything out that isn't either directly relevant to my father's story, or at least relevant to me and my struggle with my father. So, like his conversations with his wife are about, the topic of his father comes up in his conversations with his wife, but we don't get a lot of info about Art Spiegelman's relations with his wife outside of that more narrow context.
Francois a really, like I said, she's a very interesting woman, and I think that she is definitely the better part of them. When I first met her, she was so supportive of him and so nice to his dad. She converted to Judaism for Vladik. They went through like a month-long course, 2-month-long. It was a couple month-long course just so that Vladik could say to his survivor friends, yes, my son married a Jewish person. So Francois was willing to do that much to appease Vladek's sensibilities, and Spiegelman won't even go on the roof for him. So you see a very different type of relationship there. The other thing that MetaMouse does that I think really want to hear you guys' opinions on is they interview Spiegelman's kids. And when they interview Dash, the son, when they interview Dash, Dash specifically says something about how it directly relates to the Tennessee board and the removal of the curriculum. Dash says that he was not obviously forced or required to read Mouse. Spiegelman pointed it out on the shelf and said, it's there if you want to, if and when you're ready to read it. And Dash said, that's the way it should be read, I think. And it was like, mic drop. Tennessee school board basically got it. It's entirely justified according to Dash Spiegelman. That's
pretty amazing.
So it was just interesting to read that quote. So I'm interested to see what you have to say about that. Marm, what do you think about the choice that Spiegelman made to kind of be in between extreme art styles and ended up falling very much into this almost mundane sort of realism in terms of how he is portraying things?
Okay. Well, I'm an advocate of the style in general, right? So I feel like style in art is a little bit more of a subjective thing where you can take and leave certain styles. I like bare bones kind of grungy art. So that works for me. And then the question of relation art to narrative, the back and forth has been, is it detract? I'm defending it on the basis that it's not distracting from his father's narratives. And the second question is it bad comics? I think I'd even go further in saying, I think he is doing good comics in the sense that he is composing carefully. He's done interviews where, for example, when they first see the Nazi flag, that's like the first big panel in the comic after like page after page of small, like almost claustrophobic panels. The point is emphasis, right? Page after page of claustrophobic panels creating this tight sensation, pull back to a view of the window, and the window's framing the flag. So Spiegelman is considerate. He's not just drawing a grungy little tiny cartoon style because he can't draw any other way. He's deliberate about picking that style. I think it's to contrast it with the so like Watership Down has been brought up as a possible alternative. Dizzy's been brought up as a possible alternative. I think the best alternative to look at would be like Art Spiegelman's own like 3 or 4 page version of Mouse, where it's a little bit more 3-dimensional and it's a little bit more horrible, right? I'm going to talk about the Holocaust. The Holocaust is horrible. I'm going to draw horrible, scary pictures to show how horrible and scary the Holocaust is. Graphic novel Mouse is bare bones. I want to get those things out of the way so that the narrative communicates the horror of the Holocaust. I think it's a perfectly, I respect that artistic decision. And I basically, if the work as a whole works as a work of art, then I don't want to get too fastidious about the individual artist choices of the work of art.
Yeah,
So
I would push back against the idea that it's bad comics. I pulled up an image here that he constructed very meticulously in terms of, because to me, I kind of see some of the criticism you can make about some of the style. But when you take a look at the fact that in this particular sequence, we have Vladek remembering through a panel, and then we get this window panel, right? And it's kind of dividing the family into these different panels. Yeah, through the window pane. And then he goes and through the panels, then divides and then speaks to them. And he doesn't just kind of like allow you to just glide over this scene. He makes you kind of take, and he kind of talked about this sequence as well. Or he has talked about this and many other sequences. But in this particular sequence, he kind of describes the fact that he's not letting you breeze by them. You get them artistically. We have the kind of the image of the window, and then they're put into little window panels. And then he gives a bit of text that makes you kind of stop and kind of pause and think about these elements of the family. Well, at the very end, he's kind of outside of time here. He's outside of these panels while on the bicycle again. So in terms of this being good comics, I would say in terms of construction of the sequential narrative, it's extremely good comics in terms of its crafting. The stylistic point, I think, is the one that we're kind of having some, I guess, mileage will vary. Obviously, Picard did not care for the style in some respects.
Let me get you. Do you know who Jason? His name is just Jason, the comic artist.
I remember you bringing this guy up before.
I feel like that would be like a great follow-up. Like he is doing today what Art is doing in Mouse, not with respect to the subject matter of the Holocaust, but respect to the artistic decision of simple animal characters with minimal crude features. And I really love his work, right? That might be a neat follow. If you like the artistic dimension of Mouse, I think you'd really like Jason's work.
So while we're talking about
by that standpoint, Arthur's a similar artistic decision.
Not the original.
Okay, the books or the TV show?
I would say the TV show more than the books, if I remember the books correctly.
I don't think Arthur is as well constructed in sequence. I don't think you can make that same comparison, because like when he another sequence that comes to mind is the one where they first come into Auschwitz, and he structures the panels vertically, so you literally go down into Auschwitz. Like he is, in so many cases, he is deliberately setting these panels and sequences up, resketching them like a dozen times from different angles, and then settling on the one he thinks will capture the moment in the way that, in his mind at least, does do justice and does not embrace sentiment, because he hates sentiment. And I like sentiment, so I part ways with him on that value judgment. But in terms of how he is crafting comics, and comics often falls upon its relationship of sequence of images or series of images in terms of the ideas between particular panels, even if it's not the events from a narrative perspective. I I have to hand it to the fact that, and you mentioned this earlier, Larry, when you said that it's very well crafted, and I think that speaks to it being good comics, though, because comics is crafting narrative through sequence.
But at the same point in time, though, it's clear he's crafting it in a way because he doesn't like comics as a medium. He understands the art and the technique of comics as a medium, but you really get the feeling he doesn't like it.
Where are you getting that from? Because like from his personal accounts, he does like comics a bunch. Like what are you seeing that he doesn't like about them?
I think maybe you're mistaking his not liking life, like the universe.
I mean,
the cynicism.
Because like he doesn't like the world. He doesn't like. He's not a fan. I mean,
maybe that. I think that's fair.
I think he's a fan of his wife and his kids, and I think that's probably it. Which I can relate to that a lot.
And, you know, looking at this particular page and thinking about it, maybe it's because I've seen too many, Brian Michael Bendis and Tom King comic pages written like this that it kind of just turns me off. That this just feels like it's pretentious the way he's setting this up, even though it's effective for what he's trying to craft and design and do. Maybe it's the fact that so many people are trying to emulate aspects of his style, and they're doing it even less effectively than he did. That's kind of making me, in retrospect, view his style worse.
No, I could see that. That's the Watchmen conundrum in some respects.
Well, and Mouse is really word heavy, but it's a narrative, actually, as a narration driven thing. So I think it kind of has to be.
Yeah.
But it has plenty of imagery though. Like
I'm just saying, like it's a dude making a comic about stuff his dad said.
Right. No, I agree with that. I guess what I'm saying is I don't see I don't read this myself and go, oh my gosh, Balloon Lord Bendis. Because with Balloon Lord Bendis, it's always how much of his dialogue is unnecessary and actually makes me feel less involved in the story.
And it obscures the art.
Exactly. How much of Balloon Lord Bendis is he wants to be like this and he's not as competent as Art was?
I don't know.
I think that's a pretty fair statement.
But I would say that I did not read a dialogue balloon in Mouse and go, that dialogue balloon was completely unnecessary. Why was it there? I read Balloon Lord Bendis all the time and go, that was an unnecessary balloon. Get rid of it.
You see, there's your problem, Twitless. Why are you reading Bendis all the time? I quit.
No.
Years ago.
No. I'm not saying I'm just. You get you get what I'm saying. Okay.
Yes, I do.
Okay. I'm saying that when I read Bendis, I often am struck by like, that was an unnecessary balloon, and that was an unnecessary balloon, and that entire sentence or paragraph or half a page was like unnecessary dialogue that just wasted my time. And with everything that Vladek says, I don't think it's unnecessary. It's all part of the narrative. And I'm pretty Spiegelman still cut a bunch. So
and I'd say I would agree with that. Everything Vladek says that I think belongs, but there just is so much because I don't know if we want to start wrapping up, but we might want to.
Okay.
Because we've already talked about anyway. But I think a lot of the stuff that Art says in the book doesn't necessarily need gone over anymore. Also, side note, I had not realized, I was looking up his actual first name's Isaac. Like,
okay,
Isaac.
Are we talking about Art or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Art. Yeah.
So the weird thing about these people is the fact, I don't want to say that, have that come out wrong. They have so many different names because they have their Hebrew names. They have their like Polish names. They have the names they came to in America that Art then changed his name when he was renamed at like Ellis Island or whatever. They have when it comes to like Vladek was called Will. I think in America he was called William at time by people. So like the levels of names and how that represents how many nations and countries and cultures they were a part of. It's something else.
It was just one of those things where you're like going from Itzhak to Arthur. That's a big jump. That's all I'm saying.
So I converted and I had to come up with a Jewish name. But what I can say, knowing from people who have a Jewish name but have an American nickname, they generally don't want one that resonates with being Jewish. The ones who are proud of being Jewish just stick with their Jewish names because those are biblical names that are, in America, part of the breadth and depth of American culture for, like, old-timey names.
Yeah, it's not uncommon. The reason, like I say, to even bring it up is it's not uncommon to meet an American of any, nationality or ethnicity named Isaac.
Right.
I've known, Mexican Isaacs. I've known Germanic Isaacs. I've known Black Isaacs. It's really common.
But from my cultural experience, and I encounter someone who's Jewish who goes by a non-Hebrew name, sounding nickname, they're people who tend to be insecure about being Jewish. Which is one of the most Jewish things ever.
Yeah. Art's insecurities are like his
in the secular Jewish world, or in the Orthodox or conservative Jewish world.
Well, the conservative Jewish world is also secular, but in the secular Jewish world, if you're in that frame of mind, you'd call yourself Art. That's a sign that you're insecure about your Judaism. You feel uncomfortable being a Jew in a non-Jewish world.
So Art believes ultimately that we need to convince everyone, and this is again a part of difference I have with him, is he kind of wants the entire world to be viewed as diaspora Jewish in a sense. He ends up saying something like, we need to convince Yasser Arafat and George Bush that we're all basically diaspora Jews in this kind of post-Holocaust world. And it kind of makes it reflecting on the Christianity that we often relate to our streams. It's another problem I have with his worldview, because it makes the Holocaust like the central point of history, which means it's a complete rejection of the Christ and the redemption of history that allows us to not be our past, to allow us to actually imagine and work towards a redemptive and better future. And Spiegelman's entire world is basically, no, Western Civ died at the Holocaust. The entire world is the Holocaust. And the only way forward is to recognize that we're all diaspora. And it's like, I'm like, people from China, do they have to recognize this too? It's a very there's a certain weird Westernish kind of centrism.
What's weird is that's replacement theology, which is a form of anti-Semitic theology where you replace Jews with a non-Jewish group. It's just the coin's flipped. Jewish identity is now everyone's identity.
Yeah,
it's a very weird,
interesting take, that Larry. Not something I thought of. I like that. I like it running into things I've never thought of.
Yeah, it's a really weird way that Spiegelman processes his reality. And like I said, it's completely antithetical to what we think of as Christians. But that's also why Spiegelman refers to Christ as a superhero who walked on water, which really kind of got my cackles up when I read that.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't want to get into that particular topic at the minute. But the other thing that comes to me about that is that the Holocaust was horrific, and I'm not trying to be dismissive of it, but it's not unique. The just a decade after the Holocaust, what the Russians did to I can't even remember the people group's name.
The kulaks?
Yeah, the kulaks is, it was nearly, and it was nearly as bad in the numbers of people that were killed by the communist regime in the 50s. My goodness, it's exponential.
Well, hold up, Matt. It's even better than that. Winston Churchill put Jews in concentration camps in 1945 in Cyprus.
I don't think I even knew that.
When Jews were fleeing to go to mandate Palestine from Eastern and Central Europe, they were put into concentration camps in Cyprus, and the British government didn't have resources to take care of them, and disease became rampant. People started dying, and the British government had to capitulate to just let them all in because it was a huge public relations fiasco.
So basically, they were intending as a staging area before getting to Palestine. Was that the
that was the intention, although they were really wanting to relocate them back into Central and Eastern Europe because of complications in the British and the Mandate Palestine political situation.
Oh yeah, the British have been fouling up the Palestine situation since they first got there after the destruction of the caliphate.
Let me interject here. Evie has an excellent point. Instead of out of Africa, it's out of camps for Spiegelman. Can we highlight that comment? That was very well put.
Yeah.
I really like. I think that's Spiegelman's view to an extent.
Well, and I mean, and I was getting on to talking, China with what happened after Mao took power was I mean, it wasn't necessarily ethnic based, but it was still, people in the party versus everybody else, and it ended up with what was it, 12 million people being killed or starved to death. So I mean,
Star says it was the Holodomor. I think
Holodomor.
Yeah.
Holodomor is how it's pronounced.
Holodomor. Okay, Holodomor. Okay.
Holodomor.
Thank you. And Cross Comics says hi.
Ukrainians. Okay. So yeah, but yeah, I mean that's one of those things. Is like, I mean, humans hurting other humans for racial, religious, political reasons is common, and the Holocaust was uniquely terrible in the efficiency that it was done, and I don't think anybody should forget that. But like,
is there a tendency for modern Jews when looking at the Holocaust to allow it to create like a permanent victim mentality?
Yes.
Right?
Yes, and the Jews don't also want to look at the broad spectrum of it, like the Roma people who are killed, the mentally ill and disabled world, and the fact that the killing of the mentally ill and disabled was widespreadly protested by Christians in Germany in the early part of the Holocaust, and then it was stopped until the later part of the Holocaust, which adds an entire different dimension to the horror of it, of that if people actually stood up and resisted the mistreatment of Jews, Jews probably would have lived, but again, we don't want to have an accurate teaching of the history of the Holocaust.
I will just add that Spiegelman also says in a piece, I think for the New Yorker, that he said something like the Holocaust has become a kind of the binding agent for especially the secular Jewish culture. Like it is their like identity. It's the kind of moment that kind of creates the modern secular Jewish identity, I think, for at least according to Spiegelman. And that's
fair.
And that's a very important realization that informs a lot of Holocaust literature, and it informs a lot of I think other cultural movements as well.
And it's one of those things, and I think that's true. But I want to kind of circle back to the idea of the Holocaust was unique in scope and place. It was not unique in the heart of humanity, right? Is that it was the culmination of it was the culmination of centuries of depersoning that the Jews in the East had experienced, and that's something people do to each other, right? I mean, like the Indian Wars in America were complicated, but some of that definitely happened.
There's a dehumanization element to the treatment of Native Americans in American history, right? Okay.
Yeah, and in some ways it was on both sides of the scale, but one side had better technology. That was one aspect of some of that.
Spiegelman attributes that to tribalism in general, which is why he kind of embraces globalism as his only answer to.
Right, but globalism is not an answer either, because global ambitions—that's exactly what fueled the.
I didn't say I agreed with him. I'm just saying that's what he's. That's what he's.
Sorry, you caught me. You caught my knee jerk.
I know.
My anti-communist hackles.
I'm just telling you that he's very in a weird way. He kind of, I think, is. He's clearly a part of a tribe in some respects, but he's very much resistant to it as well, and he's very much, I think, an embracer of the kind of globalist vision, which makes sense if you think about him as a citizen of New York as well. He's very much a New Yorker, which he worked. He's written his career around the New Yorker. I think really speaks to his viewpoint on things. Which also bugged me. If I could just make a slight aside, when he spoke in that interview, he was speaking to people from Tennessee, and his New York side really kind of had a couple moments where he was kind of poo-pooing on the South, which I did not appreciate, because he said just a couple offhand things, but he basically could not let it slide. That he said, "Oh well, if I were a part of this." I would have fled the state, is what he said. I would have fled. He said, I would have much earlier fled the state when he referred to Tennessee. So that sort of like, metropolitan we're kind of better than you bigots in the South. He couldn't resist having at least poke its head at least once.
Yeah, that's
Even though that ignores his father's story when his father lived in cosmopolitan cities in Poland, and it was in Czechoslovakia and other cosmopolitan parts of Europe with hundreds of years of history.
I just.
But anyway, but he's definitely not his dad.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that's a couple notes from the chat talking about the if we pretend that there's no other evil outside of Hitler, as a society, Taylor points out Hitler allows other bad guys to this day to get away with evil by becoming the ultimate evil to which everyone gets compared and contrasted.
Right.
And to Taylor's point, that's actually something that's discussed in political science, that prior to Hitler, that was never a thing that was done. Nobody talked about, this guy's the next Napoleon. No, nobody did that. And then that became a thing after Hitler, and that defines our dialectic.
Unless it was somebody that was looked at as a good thing. There were people that wanted to be Napoleon in terms of like, oh, he's Napoleon, as though his desire to become the god of Europe wasn't tyrannical or something. So the other thing is, Mr. Solomon, thank you for sticking around. I think it's the first time I've seen you in the chat, and I appreciate your input. Said a lot of these issues are widely discussed, or are discussed amongst Jews, and I appreciate that we're discussing that something that's not out of the West. Star mentions that people don't want folks talking about how if people defy governments, they could have stopped governments. They want compliance, especially in public school, and I do agree. That we have them. Our education is a machine designed for compliance, not for thought.
I'm getting a flashback to Earthboy Jacobus.
Yeah. Well, that comes back to something that Evie says in the chat also, that Twitless flipped the anti-commie switch.
Yeah. Whoopsie.
Metal says no one ever wants to be the next Eric the Red for some reason.
Goodness gracious. What about the next Frederick Barbarossa?
Ooh. But yeah, so yeah, I think that's I think we hit everything.
Yeah. I think we need to give Marm like a uninterrupted 5 minutes to counteract some of our critiques, so we can lean into why Mouse is good.
My definition of being a fanboy is that you're so emotionally invested in a thing you can't look at a thing from another angle. It's kind of like you highlighted things I thought while reading it. But it's kind of like the fact remains that I don't know if I told this story behind the scenes or not, but whenever I pick up this book to start reading it, I have to be careful. Like I can't like look at Mouse casually, because if I start reading it, I get absorbed into the story and I get to the end and say, wow, I accidentally read Mouse again, right? So to me, that tells, for me, subjectively, this is an incredibly effective work of art, right? And that's completely leaving aside like the pretense stuff. Like, is it hurting comics by bringing a pretentiousness into comics? I'd love for us to do Scott McCloud, because I would like to lay all of the blame for ruining comics on Scott McCloud's understanding comics, and
I could be on board with you about that really, really easily.
I'll be the one pushing back then.
Okay. All right. Look for a future Mattriarchy against Scott McCloud.
I'm joking there, right? Like Spiegelman is contributing to
at least I'll get to have Thierry Grunstein. No one will counter me on Thierry Grunstein being the best guy ever.
All right.
So sorry. I interrupted your uninterrupted moment. My apologies.
That's all right. I don't know Thierry Grunstein. All right. So again, it's an effective work of art. My feelings about it are almost identical to Harry Potter, where I really like Harry Potter, but I feel Harry Potter cringe when I see people talking about Harry Potter. I really like Mouse, but I feel cringe when I see New York Times reviews of Mouse. Right? It's NPR, right? It's the first NPR bait book, and I don't like NPR bait, but I kind of don't blame Mouse for starting the NPR bait phenomena. It started the NPR bait phenomena. I blame it for starting the NPR bait phenomenon. He was doing his own thing before that became, yeah. That's really kind of like my
I-
uninterrupted thought. I would still read it. I would read it. I would give it. And I wrote that quote from his son. I would, if I had a kid, I'd let my kid be aware that this is a tough look at the experience of a family in a really awful time in history, right? And I wouldn't like force them to read it. I don't know if I like the idea of Maus being the book to teach kids about the Holocaust. I think that, I don't know. I feel like the task of teaching history, I don't know. Can you? The problem is, do you have to dumb it down for the dumb kids, or is your goal to try to get them to understand like this big picture? As a introduction to trying to talk about these things for dumb kids who can't read, I think it serves that purpose really well. And then hopefully the good history teacher expands upon that to try to talk about some of the broader picture that that Dan was talking about. I'm distracted here. There we go. Sorry, that Larry was talking about. My bad. I'm doing an experiment. I'm trying to see if I can draw while doing a live stream today. I'm testing my ability to multitask. Sorry, everyone.
How's it going?
I'm waving my hands a lot while I'm drawing. I'm Italian. I wave my hands while I talk. So the experiment kind of failed.
But that comment from his son is weird to me, because if I wrote a book and drew a book where I was coming to terms with my father and my son, I said, listen, this is me going through a process of learning about your grandfather who's dead now, and you don't have a chance to get to know him in this way.
Mhm.
I would tell my child to read a book in that exact context, because you should know your grandparents.
Yeah. Well, and also a little bit of clarity. It appears that Vladek died in the early 80s. So that was before Spiegelman's kids were born. So
Yeah.
that's
That's what I was trying to mention earlier.
Yeah.
He died before the kids.
There were some conflicting things about when he exactly died, and so I had to do some looking while Larry was talking earlier.
Yeah.
But it seems to have been in the early 80s. So.
Yeah, Dash basically said if you make someone read this, they're going to resent it, and that's going to basically kind of color the work. So he said it needs to be kind of openly there, but not like. Basically, he pretty much said it shouldn't be curriculum, which I thought was hilarious. like, don't make people read this, and it's like that's what curriculum is.
Well, I mean, it's really personal. I mean, that's like when last week when we had Doug on accidentally, which was great, talking about how he wrote this part of Earthboy Jacobus was him making a fantasy story, a sci-fi fantasy story about his mental process of going into fatherhood and about the people he knew and how all these things relate. And yet, the two people the book's dedicated to have never read it. So that's fascinating.
Yep. But
everything he hoped his son would become, he is. So that's something fun. Yeah, and I do think that as a comic work of art, I don't believe it was the framing when we jokingly talk about Maus ruining comics. I do not believe that it's the framing that does that. I specifically or the art or the craftsmanship or even the narrative. I think it's the self-insertion aspect. And I know, like Twitless, that you say that like your feeling is that like without the self-insertion, how could we get those Vladek and Art moments where we see Vladek's exceeding, his excellent character. And even with his quirks, even with his flaws, even with his foibles, but there's something about Vladek that is transcendent.
It's
and I would agree.
Lovable. It's also lovable. I love it.
I would agree, but I also think that by capturing his words the way that they did, they already had much of that in there. And I don't think we needed to see. I think it was a poor editorial decision to spend. I really think those 4 pages of therapy session, like, just wrecked the biographical comic. It's such a trope after that. It's such a.
I actually appreciate it. I can see, but I can understand the criticism. One thing
it's like, like Hitchcock said, there's some things you don't show on film. People praying, people kissing, people going to therapy.
People going to therapy. Did he say that last one?
No, he didn't. That's
okay,
my addition.
That's your addition. Okay.
My addition. That people, because I think, in a comic, you can show the inside action of somebody praying, how it affects. You can demonstrate the mental. You have word balloons. Therapy does not belong in comics.
So I have a final follow-up question to the panel. Considering that Gene Luen Yang does the exact same thing with the therifying in his work, which one rubs you the wrong way more? Spiegelman's self-therapy in his comics or Yang's self-therapy in his comics?
Yang
Marm, what do you
got on
think?
my nerves. Yang got on my nerves probably because we read so much Yang. I am not against using art as a form of therapy as long as the therapy helps you. I think it becomes a trap when you start repeatedly using art as therapy. So you can, it's like reliving your trauma all over and over again. I was traumatized as a child, so I'm going to create a repetitive world where I live out that trauma over and over again. Like if you make a book about your trauma and you're done with the trauma, good for you. And maybe your discussion of the trauma helps someone else. I would say Yang got on my nerves more. It's almost like because Spiegelman basically quit comics mostly after Mouse, he hasn't done like 6 Mouse books where he's repeatedly talking about how neurotic and sad he is.
Good point.
Okay, and I'm going to say, my first exposure to that element was in reading Mouse 2 when I was 23, right? So, I didn't find it as jarring as it was in Dragon Hoops, right? Where suddenly he's, totally interrupting the flow of his carefully paced narrative so that he can talk about how problematic his problem is. When Yang did that in Dragon Hoops, that really got on my nerves, and I didn't think it was even necessary because, if people are curious about it, you can, Wikipedia it pretty easily. I mean, come on.
Yeah. I'd say Dragon Hoops because this makes sense within the New York Jewish neurotic experience. And my personal favorite therapy in comics was Christopher Priest's recent run on Vampirella, where the therapist thought therapy was BS and Vampirella thought it was legitimate, and that was actually an interesting storytelling technique.
I haven't read that, but I like Priest's stuff, so I should have. That suddenly intrigues me. So, but cool. Okay, any final thoughts or questions before we call it a show?
Matt didn't say it, so Mouse ruined comics. I said it for Matt C.
I wish Matt C had been here. This would have been really good with a 5-piece conversation. So
we'll get him next time when we'll make him read Meta Mouse. And,
he has confirmed next week, which is the Comics Creators Club.
Okay,
we are going to be reading pieces by Twitless and by Nick Mueller. So I'm excited for next week. And I can't remember who all are you guys both going to be here, Marm and Larry? I can't remember.
That's the one I was planning on attending. Yeah.
I knew Marm was because he mentioned it on Twitter this morning, but I couldn't remember who I asked immediately all of a sudden. So
and I look forward to reading Twitless's book because Twitless's book just looks fun and happy.
It is fun.
Yay!
As opposed to Mouse.
Not to poison the well, but it is fun.
So get a copy of Adventures of Omega Girl. You can read along with us, and get a copy of Demon Hunter Raven, and you can also read along with us.
Yes.
Let's get the chat involved. I think we've got nearly a full panel. I think we got one maybe to confirm. We might have a backup to plug in somewhere, but I'll be sending out copies of the book, I think, tonight, so everybody can have them well in advance. Who doesn't have them yet? Taylor says, we'll talk, Taylor. We're still figuring out our exact panel makeup because we only have a certain amount of slots.
Yes, we have a maximum of 6 slots because I'm cheap.
Because he's cheap. It's also because once you get over 6, like the conversation starts to grind.
It's really hard. Somebody either too much talking over each other, or somebody never gets to say anything because they're just like too afraid to step up.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I think that's it then. And sometime next month we're talking about Superman, and sometime next month I think we're talking about politics. So those are some other themes you've got coming up here.
Oh, is that the one where we're gonna basically decide the politics of every superhero? We're gonna do the list. Yeah.
It's Larry's special thing. I think we're looking at like 3 weeks for that one, but I got to look at the calendar. So
I enjoyed that concept, but we figured a way to make the concept work because I thought it would be horrible and cringe, but we figured out how to make it not cringe.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun. And I'm prepared to tell everyone they're wrong because everyone misunderstands how politics works. Except for me,
Okay.
and no one's been able to convince me otherwise. So,
All right.
Next week, Comics Creators Club on Wednesday. Come by, check it out. And until next time, keep reading comics.
Including
I need a better tagline. I just got to. Bye.